For Tom Vanderbilt, it all began trying to learn chess with his daughter.
There's a great quote from a grandmaster saying, before you make your move, look at it as if you were a beginner.
A is for apple.
But how do we learn new things, especially as we get older? Those are the questions writer Tom Vanderbilt began to answer by dedicating a year of his life to learning 5 new things.
Just having sort of a short attention span in life, I sort of worried about committing myself, going all into one thing.
He had plenty of ideas.
Some people had given me some great suggestions, like learn to make gelato at Gelato University in Italy. And yes, that is a thing.
Sign me up. Eventually, he settled on surfing, singing, chess, drawing, and juggling. Turns out learning really is all about taking baby steps.
The amount of times infants fall in an hour while trying to learn to walk is staggering. I think the number one lesson there is just appreciating failure. Not just what you can learn from failure, which is important, but the idea that you are going to fail a lot.
The book is called Beginners, but it's not a how-to, it's a why-to, celebrating the joy and transformative power of lifelong learning.
I mean, reading a book to learn a skill is almost useless, I would say, which is not that you shouldn't read my book, but I'm not going to teach you how to learn a skill. I just want you to get started on that process.
Tom Vanderbilt, thanks very much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Paul. Thank you.
Well, if nothing else, your book is certainly well timed in the midst of this pandemic with so much downtime. It seems like a lot of us are trying to learn something new.
Yeah, precisely. I know I did not predict the global pandemic, but nor would I wish it upon anyone. But yeah, it was striking. I mean, the entire last year, I mean, not even just extra skills like hobbies and things like that, but just learning how to live. I think during the last year, we've all become beginners during the pandemic. I mean, new ways of working, communicating, grocery shopping, you name it. And there's been, as a result of that, this tremendous boom in at-home learning, which is in some ways really helped by the internet. And there's a lot of resources that are out there now, which are free or very low cost, accessible to people. And certain things have had this, boom. I mean, let's just say, for example, the game of chess, which then got another boom thanks to this Netflix show called The Queen's Gambit, the most streamed show in Netflix history. So yeah, I didn't time it that way, but for me, it was a personal salvation, really, having some of these things to fall back on, in addition to all the other, the work I was doing and normal surviving, but during this time of being trapped at home. And I continued to learn some new things as well.
So you picked 5 things, 5 really different things to go with. Chess, you mentioned, coincidentally, but also, juggling, surfing, drawing, and singing. How did you pick those 5, and why did you decide to try to learn all of them in 1 year?
It's a good question. I felt like I was making a little bit of a college curriculum or something, going back to that day when I picked out my first classes as a freshman, but first year student. But I tried to, number one, there were things I had actually wanted to learn. There were all sorts of things. I asked some friends, for suggestions, and they were giving me really good suggestions, but they just weren't things I really had, sort of a burning desire to learn. Certainly wouldn't mind doing it, but so I tried to cover a little bit of, the humanities, athletic pursuits, sort of a musical notion there. Juggling, I sort of picked for both the thing itself and because it says a lot about the brain. And I also wanted to make sure there were things I could do in New York City without going too far away. I did travel for some of the things as well, but these are all things that really anyone can do. Surfing is a little hard if you live in Kansas or St. Louis, but you can travel once in a while. But so surfing is a little bit of an exception. And then 5, number one, I wasn't sure if I would actually like any of them that much or be that good is really the wrong thing, but whether I would just enjoy trying to learn them and just having sort of a short attention span in life. I sort of worried about committing myself, going all into one thing. I mean, people might like the book more if I had just focused on chess, for example, and become really good at chess. I mean, there's a book about poker by Maria Konnikova that's out there. It's a great book. She's actually, you're really good at poker. That didn't happen with me, but I sort of achieved what I call in the book a distributed competence among all these things, which to my mind was a victory right there. So I'm very happy with what I've chosen. I don't have any regrets.
Were there a few things you thought about that you disqualified in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there were some things like language, for example. Language, I mean, that's just such an all-consuming sort of thing that I have gone through the language learning process as well with Spanish. So I thought I wouldn't really be a true beginner in that regard. Every language is different, of course, but some people have given me some great suggestions, like learn to make gelato at Gelato University in Italy. And yes, that is a thing.
Sign me up.
I would love to have a PhD in gelato, but I just thought, well, that's traveling to Italy, and and to my mind, I mean, yes, you could become a master gelato maker, but to my mind, that was something I could probably take a crack at in my own house. So I sort of wanted to, learn these things that, again, just had been in back of my mind and would also be not really ever finished. None of these things I'm, number one, amazing at, but number two, have I achieved any kind of end result? All of these things are really lifelong pursuits, which to me is a source of satisfaction and challenge. And so the quest goes on.
It would be easy to get bogged down in the details of all of these 5 things that you tried to get some competence in. But the overarching point of the book really is about how we learn. What about that initially intrigued you, and was there an aha moment along the way where you realized, that's the key?
I mean, the question of how we learn, people have taken all sorts of cracks at this, and there's some things out there that are very well known, and just how to practice, motivation, things like that. So I tried to sort of definitely go with the existing wisdom on those things. A couple of things that sort of jumped out as I was working on this is that, number one, a lot of the hurdles I were facing were really mental hurdles. Not, it would be easy for me as a 50-something person to sort of blame physical, limitations, or, well, I just not as quick as I used to be, for some of these things getting in the way. But a lot of these things are really mental hurdles. Just to take one example, when you're trying to learn to sing, and, I'm sort of in the baritone range, there were certain notes that were a bit higher that were very challenging for me. But as I would try to hit these, just doing scales or whatever, I would have this, sensation of stress come on and my body tightening. And almost like physically, my teacher would say I was physically reaching for these high notes, like a giraffe. She said my neck was sort of stretching up. All of that is a terrible way to try to sing a high note. Singing in general, you want to be as relaxed as possible. Just keep your body loose. So my teacher came up with this little trick to sort of fool my brain into not thinking I was singing high notes, which was to actually bend down every time I approached a high note. So I sort of, that little muscle trick sort of fooled me. And after a while, I was starting to hit some of those higher notes. So it was really just because, as she pointed out, these were notes that I could actually hit while speaking, which is a very, very funny thing. But singing sometimes just puts such a mental pressure on us where everyone's afraid of singing, public performing, things like that. So that's just one example. But there are a lot of things in almost all the disciplines. This would come into my mind, that my brain getting in the way of my body. And which is the secret to learning motor skills, is to not overthink things, and which any beginner does a lot of. Just make one last point here is that beginners, if you look at them as a class in something like surfing, they're always paying attention to themselves, to their own body. Like they're looking down at the board, down at their feet, which is really the worst thing to do. It sort of gets in the way of this whole process, this whole conversation going on between your brain and your body, and just reinforces a lot of bad habits. So there's always some trick out there. Look at the shore, don't look at yourself. And when you get to be an expert, you're no longer thinking about anything. This is automatic behavior. But the beginner stage is hard in that you're always thinking.
This all sounds very Zen.
It is, yeah. And there's, of course, this notion of beginner's mind, which is from Zen Buddhism, is this notion of, how can we go back to that state of being a child again in our minds, to approach something with an absolute freshness, which has all sorts of benefits. Number one, being able to look at things in a new way that might not be possible in your current state after you've spent your whole life trying to absorb all this wisdom. And I find that notion very, sort of intoxicating, and it comes up a lot in all sorts of disciplines. With chess, for example, there's a great quote from a grandmaster saying, before you make your move, look at it as if you were a beginner. Meaning, I've been playing chess a long time. He was saying, I know all the moves that are out there, yet is there something I'm not seeing? What if I were just approaching this without that wisdom, without these preconceptions possibly getting in the way?
Well, and you mentioned taking sort of a childlike approach. I noticed that a lot of the research that you did frequently led back to something having to do with how children learn, how infants learn. There's a lot to be gathered there, I take it.
Yeah, and what really got me started on the book was my own daughter, who was then 4 years old, wanting to learn the game of chess, which I didn't know how to play. So, I think anyone who's a parent, has been a parent, knows that sensation of having a young child and their whole life is just basically dedicated to learning. And the parent is usually the kind of overseer of that learning. Yet often, as I was on the sidelines, just basically taking them to lessons and dropping them off and staring at my phone while she was doing her thing. And that's what sort of prompted this whole journey was, hey, maybe I could do some of the same things she's doing. Maybe we could even take some of those lessons together, which so, I was fascinated by her learning process and led me to study, we're all beginners at some point when we're born. We're beginners in everything. We basically know how to breathe. So I went to the Infant Action Lab, for example, at New York University, a fascinating place where they study infants who are learning to walk and to move around. And there are all sorts of lessons to be absorbed from the way they do these things. But I think the number one lesson there is just appreciating failure. Not just what you can learn from failure, which is important, but the idea that you are going to fail a lot. The amount of times infants fall in an hour while trying to learn to walk is staggering. It could be up to, I think the researchers identified 70 as the upper bound of the number of falls infants took. Infants are well built to handle those falls. A 50-year-old trying to surf is a little less, it's a little less friendly. But so the notion I had was that you just need to build in failure to your learning. And if you don't sort of just be ready for that, don't get freaked out by it, and just soldier on if you can.
Well, and the mindset of a child is so important, and you bring that out really well with one particular anecdote I'd love for you to relate to folks, is the story about the young boy at the funeral home.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to that beginner's mind. It was a story in the New York Times about a group of relatives who had gathered for the death of a family member, for the funeral of a family member that had died. And there had been a little bit of a mix-up at the funeral home, and they had put out the wrong body, which is, sort of a horrible thing. But all the adults basically thought it was their beloved relative. They were all sort of they all thought something was a bit off, but they thought, well, that's that's the way the undertaker worked on this person. They all found ways to excuse it, except this young boy who was the only one who said, I don't think that's the person we think it is. And this is, kind of like the Emperor's new clothes story here. This is, he had that beginner's mind. He was less hung up on the thought that, well, it's a funeral home. These people are professionals. No way that could ever happen. So that's, again, that spirit of being the beginner, asking the stupid question, having the opinion that you think might be wrong, but that other people may secretly have.
Yeah, dismiss your preconceived notions as an adult because the child doesn't necessarily have preconceived notions.
All this is not to say that experts are useless or anything. It's just that even experts could sometimes incorporate a bit of that beginner's thinking, or even look to beginners for inspiration. And just to relay one other anecdote there, I found it very fascinating. A study of Nobel Prize winning scientists found that the ones who had won the prize were 22 more times likely to have participated in something like singing or being an amateur magician, some kind of activity outside of their profession. And, I don't think it's that learning to dance really helped them understand nuclear physics or anything like that, but maybe just having that sort of openness to experience, as psychologists call it, gave them a certain flexibility and adventurousness in their own thinking and led them to make these breakthroughs.
Interesting, too, is the idea of everybody going to the internet these days to learn things. I suppose there's an upside and a downside, but I wonder if learning things in person as you did is always more productive than trying to learn something on the internet.
in person gives you a little bit more motivation. Let's say someone's waiting for you on the other end of this class. There might be other people taking the class. You begin to feel a bit of a responsibility to show up. And I feel like learning in the presence of beginners is an underappreciated learning tool itself. Being able to see people of different skill levels around you, both struggling and succeeding in that thing, maybe even giving you some tips. I found incredibly useful in, for example, a drawing class, because often the teacher has 20 students or whatever. They're pretty busy. They can't always give you this one-on-one feedback. So just being able to be immersed in that. But online learning is for sure valid and is increasingly important and taps into, there's something in the brain that psychologists talk about called the action observation network, which is that the brain really fires into activity when we watch people do other things, especially when we watch people do other things with the intent of learning to do that thing ourselves. That's a more potent charge than simply watching something passively. And it just goes to the notion that this is the most effective way we learn. If you've ever bought, a piece of furniture from IKEA, you might look at the instruction manual, or and even that doesn't really work that well. You end up going to YouTube, find someone who's done it, and just basically mimicking what they've done. And we're humans are just born to mimic other humans. That's a really powerful way to learn something. So all kinds of people have learned things like guitar, Rubik's cube solving, simply by watching people go through these motions. Reading a book to learn a skill is almost useless, I would say, which is not that you shouldn't read my book, but I'm not going to teach you how to learn a skill. I just want you to get started on that process.
You have to have some aptitude for some of these things. I was just looking before we started talking at the picture that you drew, the self-portrait that you drew in drawing class. I have no idea at what point you drew that, but it's awfully good. It's so good, it makes you feel like he had to have some background in this or some aptitude for it beforehand. What is the God-given talent factor in all of this?
Well, thank you for saying that. That portrait I do, the self-portrait, that was at the end of a week-long class with Brian Baumeister, who's the son of Betty Edwards, who wrote this very famous book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And what Betty Edwards and Brian also says is that it's not a God-given talent, that it's not about this innate thing that anyone can be taught to draw. It doesn't mean anyone can be taught to be an artist. He admitted he doesn't know what that would even mean, but drawing as a motor skill, which he insisted is something that, just like any other motor skill, has to be practiced, has to be deliberately practiced, thought about. Feedback helped a lot. But there's a great exercise that happens in that class that, after the introduction, when you get there on day one, all the students are asked to draw a self-portrait, and mine look, like a lot of people's, looked terrible. It looked like some sort of I don't even like a mugshot or something, that it was so off in so many ways. And then after a week, all the students are asked to draw another self-portrait based on these, in some ways, very simple but very powerful lessons that are taught. A lot of which involve just learning how to see things for what they are, not getting caught up on, hey, that's a human face, hey, that's a nose. And so all the students, myself included, go through this remarkable transformation after just a week. This was a pretty intensive class, 9 to 3, I believe, 5 days a week for 1 week. But you can do a lot. We hear about this 10,000 hours rule to mastery, and I'm not a master drawer by any means, but I really think a lot can be achieved 100 hours. That's so. Don't get hung up on this idea that something can't be done, that you don't have an innate talent, because I really had no innate talent for drawing or music or anything else.
Most of these things you did in groups, and you met some really interesting people that you describe in the book in all of those groups. I'm wondering what common threads you seem to find between all those people, because they were really very different people within each group and between different disciplines.
Yeah, I think, number one, just what in psychology is called this openness to experience. It's a personality trait. It's one of the so-called big 5 personality traits that are said to define us. And it's not something you're necessarily born with. You can cultivate this, but it's been associated with longevity. Just the notion that you're always up for a challenge, keeping yourself nimble. And as part of that openness, though, you need humility, I think, and a sense that you're willing to put yourself out there and look like an idiot and be afraid and sing those first croaky notes, which my notes this morning would probably still be croaky. But so I found that in a beginner level class, you're getting this self-selecting group of people that are all there because they're willing to go through this. And for what it's worth, I found that a lot of the courses seem to be largely more made up by women, and some instructors even told me they suspected that women were sort of more open to being students at any age and a bit more cooperative, willing to lay themselves out there. And because to learn something, you have to have that humility that, hey, I have something to learn. You have to put your ego in check. So, and what's interesting though is that these were people, even though we were sort of like-minded, we weren't necessarily in the same profession or same social circles. We probably wouldn't have met through any other means. And I've found that being in my 50s, I have a number of great lifelong friends, but it's not the easiest thing in the world to meet new people, especially for someone who works at home, like we've all done over the last year. But and studies sort of back this up. Especially for men, it's hard to broaden your social networks. But this is just a great pool of people out there that you can really bond with over your initial fear, and as you get better, you sort of you can bond over that.
You mentioned in the book a really interesting concept about stereotypes and how stereotypes can help people self-sabotage their own learning.
Yeah, there's something psychologists call, which is stereotype threat, which is the idea that a person knows about this stereotype about them, this external stereotype, and they sort of internalize that. So while they're doing some thing, they might sort of take on that in their mind and have that out there, and it hurts their performance. And this has been seen, as some studies showed, in the game of chess. And my daughter, after she learned for a while and practiced, she started doing these scholastic tournaments in New York City, and she'd largely play boys. There are some girls, but it's still dominated by boys. And the studies show that girls, even if they have the same rating as boys, often do worse than their rating would suggest playing against boys, because there is still this notion out there that boys are just better at chess, that men are better than women at chess, even though it's a statistical artifact and has all these other things associated with it. It's still something that gets into people's heads, and she suffered with, and I would just try to talk her through it and say, and that's one thing that we're sort of online. Chess is a more interesting thing because often you don't know who you're playing, so it's and I'd love to see that study redone in an online context to see if that stereotype threat sort of vanishes. But it's out there and it's real. And I think the biggest stereotype threat of all is for the adult learner is that you're too old. Only children should learn. Children are better learners. There's no way you're going to get good at a guitar or whatever. And so the minute you pick up a guitar, you've got that in your head. You can feel it in your fingers, I think. So you just, again, just have to sort of push through that.
I'm wondering if you learned anything about teaching technique. You're an excellent writer. You don't need me to tell you that, obviously. But I'm wondering if you ever were to teach a writing class yourself, and perhaps you have before, if going through this experience has taught you anything about effective teaching.
It's a great question. One that I haven't thought about. I mean, one thing that has occurred to me is that, and you see this in the medical profession and elsewhere, that teaching is really one of the most effective ways of learning. I think the phrase is see one, do one, teach one from medical school. And I found that, just a few nights ago, for example, my daughter had to do a drawing for her art class in middle school, 6th grade. And I didn't want to sort of take over the drawing and turn in this, sort of thing that was beyond what she was doing, but I definitely wanted to jump in and give some pointers. And as I worked on it a little bit and tried to fix these little glitches, I found myself, sort of drawing upon my own memory. And this is one of the keys to learning, is memory and reaccessing that skill that you have within, and that only strengthens those sort of neural connections. So it's not really about the technique of teaching, but I feel like this is one of the most satisfying things about learning something, is then being able to teach it to someone. And I did teach her juggling as well. My wife still has not learned 3-ball juggling, but that's on my list as well. But that's a really satisfying end result of this whole process as well.
As a writer, a lot of what you've written about is the fascinating minutia of everyday life, notably your book on traffic, for instance, now a book about learning. Is this a niche you've developed for yourself? And if so, what's the next bit of daily minutia you're going to get into?
Well, it's not a conscious niche. It's just, I guess it just reflects my own weird interests. Half the time go nowhere because no sane editor would actually take on some of the projects I suggest. I mean, one of my favorite pieces, I actually wrote the piece, but it never made the light of day, was following my own bag of trash from the moment I threw it out to the landfill in Pennsylvania. And I thought it was a good, interesting piece, but I guess the editor decided it was just a bit too much in the minutia, as it were, too much in the weeds. With this book, I hope it's not a niche pursuit. I would really, this is something I think taps into a universal desire and phenomenon that we all want to continue learning, that the brain loves novelty, we love novelty, and there's really no reason to stop anything at any age when it comes to learning new things. So, but maybe to answer your question, I'll revert back with the next thing to more of a niche, but I'm not sure what that is yet.
Well, the book is called Beginners, The Joy and Transformative Power of Lifelong Learning, and it's available in St. Louis at Left Bank Books. It's a great read, great book. Tom Vanderbilt, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes, watching the ships roll in, and I'll watch them roll away again. Yeah, I'm just sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide